Please rise for our gospel this evening. Our gospel today comes from John, chapter 11, beginning with verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters, they sent a message to Jesus. "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. When Mary came where Jesus was and she saw him, she knelt at his feet and she said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to the Lord, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. There was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is such a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This is the gospel of our Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I'll invite April Paxton from Michelson Funeral Home to speak some words about grief and loss.
Good evening. This is a little bigger group than we had at noon. My name is April Paxton, and I work at Michelson Funeral Home. I was hired in January of 2016, with my role being to help people pre-plan their funerals. As I became more familiar with my role and my position grew, Corey and I started talking about other ways that we could provide support to not only the families that we serve, but also the community as a whole. As a funeral home, we provide an important service to the communities that we serve. However, it is very important to us that we go beyond that service to provide care and support that assists people in other ways. We see people experiencing grief on a daily basis and are often asked by families if we offer any type of support. While we have always had different resources we could refer people to, at the time we didn't have anything specific that we could personally offer. We did some research, and after reviewing several programs, decided to pursue the grief recovery method, which is offered through the Grief Recovery Institute. We like this particular program because it was an action-oriented program that helps people walk through their grief. We have been using this program since May of 2017, and I can honestly say finding this method has truly been a gift. It has allowed us to walk through the grief journeys of those we serve, letting them know they are not alone. I'm here today to offer some helpful information regarding loss and grief, and how grief can affect us not only emotionally but physically as well, and in turn leave scars that remind us of that pain. Let's talk about the definition of grief for a moment. Since grief is such a wide topic that covers so many kinds of losses and a wide range of emotions, there isn't a single grief definition that covers it all. There are, however, two that we use at the Grief Recovery Institute that help people understand what grief is. The first one and most basic is, grief is the normal and natural emotional reaction to a loss or change of any kind. While that definition is accurate in stating that it's normal and natural to feel grief, it doesn't really explain what grief is. So there's another one we like to use. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern or behavior. Most of us associate grief with death. When you hear of someone grieving, your first thought is generally that someone close to them has passed away. But in reality, there are many, many losses that we all experience over a lifetime that can cause feelings of grief. Let's explore a few of those. As I mentioned, death is definitely the most common loss that we associate with grief. When someone important dies to us, it represents an end to what has been familiar, and we must adapt to that new, usually unwanted reality. Life without your loved one. If we think back to the first definition I provided, grief is the normal and natural emotional reaction to a loss or change of any kind. The death of a loved one makes sense and fits that description. What if, however, that person who passed away was suffering with a terminal illness, and you were there to help care for them during those last months, days, or even sometimes years? Naturally, you would have feelings of grief for the loss of that person, but what if you also felt relief now that they are no longer suffering? Now all of a sudden you have conflicting feelings, so that brings us back to the second definition that I provided. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern or behavior. You're sad that they're gone, but you feel relieved that they aren't suffering anymore. What about marriage? That's supposed to be a happy time, a choice you've made to be with the one you love, but what about the independence you had as a single person? What about the freedom to do what you want when you want? What happened to making decisions on your own without the input of someone else? And now that you're married, all of that has changed. You now have to share your time, your home, your life with this other person, and what once was is no more. Decisions are no longer made on your own. You now have to take into account consideration the other person's thoughts and feelings. It's not a bad thing, it's just different. It's those conflicting feelings because of a change in a familiar pattern or behavior. What about a change in your position at work? Maybe you got a promotion. While that's a good and exciting change, your interactions with your coworkers may change, or you may be in a different department. So while you may be excited about your new position, you may also be sad about the loss of what once was. Again, the conflicting feelings because of a change in a pattern, familiar pattern or behavior. The point is, we experience many losses in life, and even choices we make that are positive, happy choices, can still produce feelings of grief, but take some comfort in knowing that those feelings are completely normal and natural. The problem occurs when we don't work through our feelings of grief and it starts to accumulate. Grief is cumulative, and it's important to know that the emotions caused by grief can build and start to affect you physically as well as emotionally. Your eating habits may change. You might be eating too much or not enough. Your sleeping habits may change. You may have extreme highs or lows with your emotions. You may start to isolate yourself. You may have aches and pains you didn't have before. Grief can affect all aspects of our lives if it's not worked through. But what if you don't know what loss is causing your pain? Using the grief recovery method, I lead 8-week classes to help people walk through their grief journey. At the beginning of the first class, I always ask the class participants what loss brought them to the class. Each person expresses in a few sentences what moved them to sign up for the class. A lot of times it's the death of a loved one. Sometimes it's a divorce or a change in a romantic relationship, maybe a move, or sometimes even health issues. But generally, there is a specific loss that brought them to that class. There was this one participant, however, that did not have a specific loss. When asked what brought her to class, she simply said, "I'm not sure, I'm just sad all the time." My initial thought was, how in the world am I going to help her? I was used to people coming to class with a specific loss in mind, but class had started and I had to figure out a way. So as we worked through each week, through the assignments, through the discussions, over many phone calls over those 8 weeks, she was able to identify all of the different losses she had experienced thus far, but more importantly, she was able to identify the specific loss that was causing her so much pain and sadness throughout her life. It became clear that she had experienced cumulative grief and it had affected many aspects of her life. But she put in the hard work and walked right through the middle of her grief. It was amazing to see the transformation in her as she worked through those sometimes very difficult assignments and discussions. And I still remember on the very last day of class, as we were walking out to our cars, she stopped me and said, "April, I just want you to know I'm not sad anymore." My point today is this: we all have and will continue to experience loss in many different forms. Death, divorce, change in job, change in health, loss of friendship, loss of a pet, and the list goes on. The grief that we experience because of those losses is normal and natural, but know that the only way to work through your grief is to go right through the middle of it. You can't go around it, you can't go over it, and you can't go under it. You have to do the work and go through it, but know that you aren't alone. There are support groups, classes, books, family and friends who are there to listen, and of course our faith, which is what brought us here today. There's a whole community here to help you walk through that journey. Remember, you don't have to do it alone. And finally, it's important to know that as you walk down this path, you may still have some tough days, but take comfort in knowing that as you continue to do the work, there will be a few more smiles and a few less tears. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, April. Completely gutted, tired, irritable, dehydrated, detached, achy, nauseous, tight in my chest. These are just a few of the descriptions I remember using to describe my grief in its most acute form following the death of my dad. And my dad's death wasn't a surprise, and yet it was. Having suffered with aggressive cancer for 11 months and eventually ending up in hospice, I shouldn't have been surprised when he died. Yet when it actually happened, the shock to my system was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I even remember responding once to the question of, "How are you doing?" with, "I just want to throw up." For me, grief was a full-body experience. The physical pain was as intense as the emotional hurt. And it's no surprise to me that when people get sick, often after the death of a loved one or when experiencing a major loss. And it wasn't until later that I began to study grief that I learned that neuroscientists have shown that a psychological wound, such as experiencing a profound loss, stimulates the same part of the brain that is stimulated when there is a physical wound. In other words, our brains process and feel these injuries in the same way. There's no distinction between hurts. And grief is how we cope with and we release the pain that we feel. We can't avoid it. And as hard as we may try, grieving itself is essential. And the only way out of that hurt is through it. Grief is how we come to terms not only with the loss we have endured, but also with what could have been if life had taken a different course. And the frustrating part is that we do not get to dictate all of the terms of our healing. Grief does more than leave scars, though. Grief is also a teacher. The Jewish mourner's Kaddish says, "At times the pain of separation seems more than we can bear, but love and understanding can help us pass through the darkness toward the light." And in truth, grief is a great teacher when it sends us back to serve and bless the living. Now, I could never have predicted it, but the learning that I experienced as I grieved the death of my dad has become paramount to my identity today. It has shaped how I understand myself in relationship to God and to the people in my life. I see community different. I see relationships differently. I see humanity differently. While our grief journeys are deeply personal, we do not have to navigate the journey alone. And to be quite honest, I do not believe it is possible to navigate the grief journey alone. It is our shared humanity, our shared losses, and our shared grief that ultimately allow us to reconnect again with the world around us. When we hurt together, we heal together. It is only in this fragile web of relationship that we discover a new purpose, our meaning, some peace and restored joy after pain and loss. Now, I am sure it is possible to heal in a mountaintop cave all alone. But for the most of us, the quickest and the deepest healing happens in the embrace of others. In today's gospel story, we hear how a community of people have gathered with Mary and Martha and Jesus outside of Lazarus' tomb. And when I read this story this week, in the context of grief, I am invited into the grave with Lazarus. Like Lazarus, we can be bound tightly in death's clothes, clothed in grief, disappointment from loss, and even hopelessness. We know that death can take place every day. And it's not just the death of loved ones, but also those little deaths that April described. We know the daily disappointments, the betrayal of a friend, a failure at work, a difficult marriage, the loneliness and pain of one longing for something more from life. These things bind us in that tomb. But we don't have to stay in that tomb. In the climactic point of our story today, two critical things happen. First, Jesus commands Lazarus to come out of the tomb. And second, Jesus commands the community to unbind him. Unbind him and let him go, Jesus says. And here's what I find so striking about this command. Jesus performs what is perhaps his most significant miracle, but he also instructs and he expects the gathered community to participate in and actually complete his miracle. And both of these things matter. The miracle is a reminder to us that while Jesus always has the power to heal, the power to feed, the power to restore the broken and to overcome death, he looks to his church, his community, you and me, to participate in this miracle of loosening people from all that limits them from abundant life. Jesus looks to us to complete his work of encouraging hope and overcoming those things that bind us. Unbind him and let him go. In our lives, there will be times when we will be Lazarus, bound by death's clothes, and in other moments, we will be part of the community gathered to unbind one another from what keeps us bound in death. And through all of this, we are never alone. Jesus walks with us. Friends, we have a loving Savior who understands what it feels like to hurt and to grieve. Jesus was at the grave with Lazarus as well, and there were tears in his eyes. And as a community, we walk with one another. We get to show up for each other. We get to be Jesus' arms, Jesus' hands, Jesus' hugs. We get to show up at deathbeds, at funerals, at gravesides, at homes with casseroles. We get to show up. And we show up not to fix, not to offer trite platitudes. Rather, we show up to create space for healing through the presence of Christ and through our listening. Grief teaches us that strength can be found in feeling our feelings. When we ignore the pain, it grows bigger and bigger. And like an abscess that is never drained, eventually it will rupture. True strength is found in being honest about our hurts, honest about our wounds, and honest about our scars. And in showing up for one another, we create space to be able to name those hurts in order to heal. And the only way to heal a hurt is to give voice to what it is the only way that we can keep our pain and loss from taking root inside of us. When we name our pain, we discover that our pain is part of a great eternal tapestry of human loss and heartbreak. We realize that we are not alone, that others have experienced and survived, and that we can survive as well. We can survive with renewed joy and happiness. When we embrace our feelings, we embrace ourselves, and we allow others to embrace us too. Grief also teaches us that resurrection does not happen without death. Christ promises us new life. Friends, the God who raised Jesus from the dead still needs us and wants us and invites us to participate in and even complete God's resurrection work. And we can do this by caring for, standing with, and lending our courage to those who are suffering and grieving. Unbind him and let him go is both a promise and our marching orders. For the God who answered Jesus' prayer in bringing Lazarus forth from the tomb, the God who raised Jesus from death, the God who promises us life eternal, this God is not finished yet. And we are the instruments of God's resurrection life, grace, and power here and now. Amen.